Hello, you know what day it is. Let's start with the second part of The Curse of Tina. We had the first part by the BBC's Adam Curtis. Learning to hug. Everywhere on television today, people hug and burst into tears. It happens in drama a lot, but it has completely taken over factual programs too. It usually comes at the end when the characters finally realise that they should express their true feelings, and they do this by crying and hugging everyone in sight. It is part of something much wider in modern society, the belief that one should aim to be authentic. And the way to do this, to become authentically yourself, is to learn to get in touch with your inner feelings and express them. If you button up yourself, have a stiff upper lip and control your emotions, then you are both inauthentic and somehow damaged as a human being. And it goes on, it's a blog post, but he does it just like a documentary. There are many videos involved in it, just like the first one. And it finishes like this. And people's desires to imitate each other is potentially a powerful force. Essentially, when things like Facebook can intensify and amplify that desire. This is really interesting territory. It can create movements that can change the world for the better, but it can also be dangerous, because this was the motive for the great mass political and social movements of the first half of the 20th century. Nationalism, communism, fascism and totalitarianism, and they are frightening. And it raises a question: maybe the rise of modern individualism in the West after the Second World War was not just about personal self-expression and freedom, but also a very good way of burying a frightening other truth about human beings. They are driven by the desire to imitate each other and are therefore vulnerable to political manipulation. If we can be taught to hug, we can just as easily learn to march and chant. Expanding on that theme, but obliquely, as this line going up from 1983 to the modern day, expanding net percentage of US population living in a household receiving some government benefits. It is effectively 50% now of households in the United States receive some form of government benefit. A rather annoying thing, this from Wisconsin. This is Marginal Revolution blog. The "You Have Two Cows" challenge. We start with normal stuff. Socialism. You have two cows. The government takes one and gives it to your neighbour. Communism. You have two cows. You give them to the government and the government then sells you some milk. Capitalism. You have two cows. You sell one and buy a bull. So under what type of ism do you have two cows but the government says that you can't drink their milk? Whatever we call such an ism, it may help to know that it is the one that we live under in the United States of America. In a recent case in Wisconsin, this was summarized by the judge. Plaintiffs argue that they have a fundamental right to possess, use and enjoy their property, and therefore have a fundamental right to own a cow or a herd of cows and to use their cows in a manner that does not cause harm to third parties. They argue that they have a fundamental right to privacy, to consume the food of their choice for themselves and their families, and therefore a fundamental right to consume unpasteurized milk from their cows. And in replying to himself, the judge Fielder wrote, "No, Plaintiffs do not have a fundamental right to own and use a dairy cow or dairy herd. No, plaintiffs do not have a fundamental right to consume milk from their own cow. No, plaintiffs do not have a fundamental right to produce and consume foods of their choice. That's America. That's rather naughty the way that's all going. Over in Europe, will a fat tax make Denmark healthier? Now, over the weekend, Denmark became the first country to tax saturated fats. The tax, 6 Danish kroner per kilogram of saturated fat in a food, works out to about $6.27 per pound of saturated fat. It hits all foods with saturated fat content above 2.3%. Danes reportedly began hoarding butter and other fatty products before the new regulations kicked in. Think that'll save Denmark? BBC News in the Middle East: Saudi Arabia clashes in eastern province of Qatif. 14 people have been injured in clashes in eastern Saudi Arabia, state media say. They said the unrest in the province of Qatif late on Monday had been incited by a foreign country, without elaborating that it was Iran. Qatif, you can see just about on the chart there, right next to Bahrain, where they are still sentencing more doctors and nurses to jail, and they are predominantly Shias in that area, but Sunni in the majority of Saudi Arabia. Bloomberg: Saudi Arabia may tap reserves for spending plans. October the 4th from Bloomberg: Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, may be forced to tap its reserves to fund spending programs as oil drops below the kingdom's break-even budget price. King Abdullah this year announced a $130 billion plan to create jobs and build homes after uprisings toppled leaders in Tunisia, Egypt and Libya. While officials haven't said whether they'll sell debt or draw on reserves, as they did 2 years ago, an oil price below $85 to $90 a barrel is break-even level, as estimated by Citigroup, and this may force them to act. Now, plenty of interesting things there, but Citi reckon that break-even level for the budget of Saudi Arabia is now $85 to $90 a barrel that they will always be wanting. And that's this year, and they are what is called the swing producer, as in their mass of production can alter the price up and down, and they presumably will always want the price to be now a minimum of $85 a barrel. And it's a lot more than that because that's the Brent price, but even WTI out of Cushing seems to be hanging on pretty stoically to $80 even from Cushing. Europe navigating stormy waters from the International Monetary Fund. Lots more facts and figures for Nikki to play with. Now, I've chopped, if you go to this chart in the PDF, you'll find that I've chopped it in half to make the world on the bottom of this Euro chart. But what we have is real GDP growth and CPI inflation on the other side. But it's the real GDP growth that I want to point out. Euro area 2009 was the big hiccup, but it must be understood that if you have a big hiccup and go minus, in a way that's taken away from projections which would never be minus. They will have been plus lots. So you've got a gap that needs to be made up, and they're just not making up that gap or even getting ahead. Following along 2010, 11 and 12, the projection for 12, 1.8, 1.6 and 1.1, and those are percentages of growth. Drop down to the bottom, the United States, again, the drop back in 2009, 3.5%. Let's say they made it up in 2010 in the United States, so now we're calling it quits. It's not quits, nearly, but we're going on into the future now with 2011 and 12 at 1.5 and 1.8%. So a little way of looking at this, the euro area and the United States GDP, let's say it's 14 trillion, both of them, each, 28 trillion, the two of them. Now, if you've got, let's call it 28 trillion for the two of them, if you're going to have an increase of growth of, it's between 1 and 2, isn't it? So if it was 1%, that 28 trillion, that's $280 billion increase, or $560 billion for the two of them increase if they get 2%. That's an increase of growth of the real GDP. And if you think, well, let's go to the European zone then. Eurozone, it's going to be about 1% of 14 trillion, 140 billion. Now, when you start hearing things about bailing out banks and how much money is going to be necessary for this, that and the other, that is the extra money that is available, a mere 140 billion. It is a lot of money, but 140 billion when it's needed hither and thither doesn't really go very far. And that's your growth number. Right. Pushing on to the UK and the Office of Budget Responsibilities Economic and Fiscal Outlook November 2010. I've referenced back to this because we got this chart from it, which was their estimation of the GDP and their hose, their fan chart. The solid black line is what they think it's going to be, and then you've got the upper possibilities and the lower possibilities, and the lighter it gets, the less likely it is. So if we go on to this, is from yesterday, and UK GDP growth has been revised down to 0.1% in the second quarter, and then we go back to this one from the Office of Budget Responsibility and their projection, and the red lines that I've put in is what's actually happening. This is just to say that these people that do these projections are so very, very often overly optimistic. So when I talk about the Eurozone having this extra 140 billion of growth, and that's, it's not for governments to spend, that's growth in the whole of everything. The government doesn't get all that to spend, or the Eurozone doesn't have it to spend. It's just that's the actual growth number. If the number that goes to government's extra to spend is very small indeed in comparison. So let's finish my Thursday with how to remove a bladder stone in the days before anaesthetic. If you visit Gordon Museum at Guy's Hospital in London, you will see a small bladder stone, no bigger than 3 centimetres across, besides the fact that it has been sliced open to reveal concentric circles within. It is entirely unremarkable in appearance, yet this tiny stone was the source of an enormous pain for 53-year-old Stephen Pollard, who agreed to undergo surgery to remove it in 1828. Although the operation itself lasted only a matter of minutes, lithotomatic procedures were painful, dangerous and humiliating. The patient, naked from the waist down, was bound in such a way as to ensure an unobstructed view of his genitals and anus. See illustration, but I'm not going to show the illustration. Afterwards, the surgeon passed a curved metal tube up the patient's penis and into the bladder. He then slid a finger into the man's rectum, feeling for the stone. Once he had located it, his assistant removed the metal tube and replaced it with a wooden staff. The staff acted as a guide so that the surgeon did not fatally rupture the patient's rectum or intestines as he began cutting deeper into the bladder. Once the staff was in place, the surgeon cut diagonally through the fibrous muscle of the scrotum until he reached the wooden staff. Next, he used a probe to widen the hole, ripping open the prostate gland in the process. At this point, the wooden staff was removed and the surgeon used forceps to extract the stone from the bladder. Unfortunately for Stephen Pollard, what should have lasted 5 minutes ended up lasting 55 minutes under the gaze of 200 spectators. The good old days. Bye.